unfold. So at first, Pete's going to walk us through the work. And then after his remarks, since it's really hard to have a conversation with dozens of people online, we're going to break into smaller groups so we can talk about the work with each other in a more intimate, sort of understandable setting. And then we'll come back after about 15 minutes to reconvene with Pete. We'll have time to ask questions of him and others, and we'll seek to wrap up right around 7:30. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Pete Brook.
Thanks very much, Dave. Good evening to you all. It's great to see you, even in this bizarre format. It might be new for some of you. It's not for me. I've been teaching the past 8 weeks on Zoom. Before I get started, can I remind everyone to put their microphone on mute? Perfect. And I'll just tell you what I'm going to do today. Of course, we intended it to be a gallery show. And that was more than just selecting the prints and putting them on the wall. 4 of the bodies of work were designed as installations. So this may still happen. We hope it'll still happen. Maybe towards the end of the summer, we'll be able to have, by appointment only, visits to SF Camerawork. But the work by Wray Herbert-King was an installed video piece with attendant prints. The work by Herena was sort of like a mock of a newsroom with hundreds of prints strewn on tables for people to leaf through. The work of Jodi Darby was inside of a freestanding tent to almost mimic a used car sales lot and to really ramp up the notions of consumerism that sort of like feed through her video piece. And then, of course, Anchor's work with the Free Mind Collective, as you'll see, is this expansive body of work with hundreds of images and hundreds of captions, questions, and answers. And so there's a lot of things that we can't do tonight that we would be able to do if we were in a physical space together. So that's just a caveat. I've put together a presentation that I hope will show off the best of the works, even given the circumstances. And I want to say, feel free to interrupt me during the presentation if there's anything that's unclear. If you have like a burning question, we've got plenty of time for that at the end. But if I gloss over something and miss an essential piece of information that would help with your understanding, please do pause me. It's very informal tonight. And I want you all to get as much information as efficiently as possible. So I'm going to share my screen now. And we'll get going. I'm hopeful that you all can see this big title page. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Great. So Cell Signals is, yeah, I'll say 5 years in the making. And it's in the same way that my previous exhibition, Prison Obscura, which debuted in 2014, was also 5 years in the making. It's not that it takes that long to find good art about mass incarceration, but it does take that long to find good projects that are accessible, in some cases freshly made, and that work together. And when I say work together, I mean all of these bodies of work will have elements, be it an issue or a tone or an approach, a technique, a use. And so they speak to one another in different ways, which means that in a gallery, as you're moving around, those things sort of like reveal themselves to you in the space. I'm going to have to be a bit more explicit tonight with how the bodies of work function together. But I'd first like to say thank you to the artists who are in the show. We have 3 of them in the room. with us. We have Adam Chin, we have Robert Gumpert, and we have Brandon Tauszik in the room today. So they'll be able to help me out when I start stumbling or maybe describing their work in terms that they may or may not agree with. And so what does it do? Cell Signals brings together these bodies of work that use archive reels, TV and cable news, often that's been redistributed on YouTube. It uses collaborative portraiture, test shots, so shots that weren't even intended as the primary project within a prison, but came to symbolize something new and fresh, and prison newspaper coverage, photojournalism from inside a prison by a prisoner for a prisoner-made newspaper. That's not very common across the United States. And we have the privilege of knowing Eddie, who got out of San Quentin about 18 months ago and has a huge archive that we're going to dip into soon. And one of my worries is A, the scale of mass incarceration, but more B, what do we do about it? Now, I don't make any assumptions that any of us have or have not been impacted by the system. Some of us may have been inside, some of us may have friends and family. Talking about prisons and mass incarceration is a very emotive issue for most, but it's one that when you get to know, you understand that what the system purports to do doesn't actually do in most cases. It's my belief that rehabilitation is almost impossible inside the majority of US prisons and jails. There are over 6,000 locked facilities in the United States. That's county jails, state prisons, federal penitentiaries, immigrant detention centers, which are the booming sector, to use a rather crude term, and then private prisons also. And we actually only get to see inside a very small number of those. San Quentin, we'll talk about more, is a prime example. And that's because it has this outward facing PR savvy consideration of itself. San Quentin wants to be a model prison, and part of that is inviting not only programs in, but PR and media to cover the programs. Maybe Rikers or Sing Sing in New York State would be known. We've seen those in the news. But generally, there's a dearth of imagery. And so we can ask ourselves, what do we do with our daily visual diet in terms of informing ourselves? And then we can ask, what is presented to us by earnest, thoughtful artists who want to really like hammer down on a particular topic within the issue of mass incarceration? And what use can we make of their artistic creative works? So we're going to start with Jodi's work. It's called Carceral Sales Event. This is a 6-minute video that we commissioned specially for Cell Signals. And it collides a selection of images. It collides commercial TV advertisements for household products, along with instructional videos from manufacturers of, how should we put this? Riot hardware, crowd management hardware, different apparatus that necessarily functions for prisons to function. She also introduces images from the 50s and 60s of commercialism. Whether she intended it or not, and I didn't actually ask her this, you know, she makes an abolitionist argument, which is to say that mass incarceration emerges from capitalism. And in order to change the prison system, maybe reform isn't the solution, maybe completely rethinking society and the criminal justice system along with it is our answer and our route towards a better future. And then she said she used just 2 or 3 Hollywood videos, Hollywood films, sorry, Hollywood cinema, and stills from those. In order to make, and I keep calling it a collision, these things crash together, not allowing the viewer to disassociate them. Some people might think it's heavy-handed. Personally, I do not. It's an argument that I can agree with. I think America's lie to itself, beginning in the post-war years, still has quite a strong grip on our society. And then finally, the other type of imagery that she uses, and she uses only one example of this, is a video of gross negligence of a prisoner in Clackamas County, which is just outside of Portland, Oregon, who was strung out on drugs. I think it was speed or amphetamine, and was in crisis. And not only was he unattended to by the deputies in this prison while he reeled around, he was also mocked by the deputies. Now, this would be tragic enough in and of itself, but this man's ultimate fate was to die. He didn't receive medical care. He wasn't carried or cared for or nurtured out of this overdose drug crisis, and he died at the hospital later. So she makes very conscious use of this footage where the audio of the deputies is really sort of like the hammer blow. It comes around the 3rd or 4th minute in the middle of the piece. And she wrestled whether or not she wanted to include this, even though this is from YouTube and this has been on cable news in the Pacific Northwest, and it's a case that's well known, and his mother is currently fighting a lawsuit against the county. Still, Jodi asked herself the question whether she wanted to include and re-traumatize folks through the use of this imagery. But she went for it, and I'm glad she did, because we need to be reminded of the harsh realities, and it's wrapped in this overall critique of the system. That 6-minute video is embedded on the SF Camerawork Cell Signals webpage, so you can browse that at your leisure. Next up, we have Answers Without Words, an absolute beautiful project, a social practice project that artist Anka Schutler did with incarcerated artists at Columbia River Correctional Institution. As a collective, they call themselves the Free Mind Collective. Letters and written responses and pen pals are very common in and out of prisons, across the walls. Photographs of correspondence, less common. People will share their family photos. People will send in pictures of prisoners' loved ones. But that serves a different purpose. That doesn't replace conversation. What Anka and the men wanted to do was to have a call and response, have a conversation, but use photography as the text as opposed to the English language. So how did they start? Anka guaranteed the men that they could connect with artists across the world. And so they formulated different questions for different countries. And then artists from as far and wide as Australia, Germany, Sweden, there was one in South America, Argentina, a lot of European countries. They responded to the men's questions with their own pictures. So at the top here is the incarcerated artist question. And this is the picture that was used to respond without words. Now, I went to visit Anchor and the men a couple of times in 2017, 2018, and you know, they could never predict in any way what the visual return would be to their question. And just on its very surface level, most simple level, opening up those packages and going through the images was a moment of surprise, a moment of wonder, a moment of learning. And it's almost like in and of itself, that's a result, but it's only one of many results to personal development and to artistic development, because all of these prisoners identify as artists, and rightly so. And there's multiple ways in which they're learning, exchanging, swapping ideas. Doesn't this make you dream of the times we used to be able to gather in classrooms? So this is 4 guys. We've got Tom in the blue, sort of like middle right. Next to him, there's Harold Fletcher. And on the very right-hand side is Spencer. And at the back is Roshani Thakore. Those 3 are affiliated with Portland State University. And then these are 4 of the participants. On the left there is Jay. And there's Jay making a photograph of Tom. I actually wanted to move this down, this slide. Oh no, that's right. So this was Anchor's graduate thesis project. So it was about 18 months in the making. Initially, when she proposed it, she only deigned or dared to propose that they ask questions and then they receive photographs in return. But then what happened is the prison gave them permission to do a photography workshop themselves, which meant that they could then return to the foreign artists and ask them to ask questions of their prison lives. And I have 3 or 4 examples here. I dismissed this picture when I first saw it, but it's become my favorite. And then, of course, there is a moment of exhibition. Cell Signals is the second exhibition that Answers Without Words has been included in. It was given its own show at the Paragon Gallery in Portland a year ago. And this is how the entire project is displayed on large, printed, rolled out sheets of paper. Imagine this scaled up so it's 6 or 8 feet wide, and imagine 8 or 10 of those next to one another. As pointed as each of the questions and images are, it still becomes an overwhelming amount of information. And it does give you sort of like a general sense of the men and their collaborative work on the inside, but then the images themselves talk about this separation. You know, there's a lot more resources at hand for the outside artists when they're making images as compared to the men in the concrete workshop room with the hard floors, hard surfaces, and they're all dressed in their prison blues, of course. The beautiful thing that I like about social practice projects is that they give up control of the product. They believe in the process and they establish a process based upon discussion with more than one person. And in the way that Anka told me to take her name out of all this exhibition's literature, because while she facilitated, she only considers herself one of many equals in this project. It's a brave approach to social practice. You don't know what you're going to get. And even if you get nothing, you can still make the argument that the product doesn't matter. The work has been done in the classroom. We, you and I, are not the primary audience here. We might not even be the secondary audience. And so I can show you these pictures because, not because I think they are necessarily the greatest photography, but because I think they are one of the greatest processes on the route to making images. How's everyone doing? Is everyone good? Christina's got a thumbs up.
We're good, we're good.
Fantastic. All right, now we're going to go to Eddie. I wish that Eddie could have been with us tonight, but Eddie has just started a young family, so I assume he's very, very busy with his baby Adeline. So Eddie, I actually met Eddie as a student, when he was a student in my class when I was teaching photo history at San Quentin. He didn't complete the class because he got released. So Eddie got out in October 2018. In the 3.5 years prior to that, Eddie worked as a photographer with the San Quentin News. I don't know how he knew, and I don't know how he maintained faith, but he says he always knew that when he was released, he would be able to take his photos with him. And sure enough, it got signed off, and a hard drive of 17,000 images was delivered to him a few days after his release. And so Eddie and I and another friend of ours, a San Francisco Chronicle editor, went through these 17,000 and picked out the ones that we thought would hold most interest. So I'm just going to share a dozen or so with you today. We start here with Eddie Herena's favorite image of all time. And it's his favorite image for, well, I'll let you think on why this might be Eddie's favorite image. It's a strong, strong image. It's not my favorite. This is my favorite. You can see in the background there's groups meeting. This is Kevin Durant. It's not uncommon at all for San Quentin to welcome famous faces. In Eddie's photographs, I've seen Lance Armstrong, Susan Sarandon, Ted Koppel. Durant is just one of the players. Drummond made a special visit. A couple of weeks after Eddie got out, Kim Kardashian visited. And that's because San Quentin is part of this, I don't want to say project because then it might seem planned, but somehow everybody from the prisoners to the staff to outside volunteers and to the administration itself have taken themselves to this place where San Quentin is program heavy, has multiple options, and it's the opposite to what most prisons are, most prisons being warehouses. There are opportunities here for the men to find themselves and engage themselves. And so Eddie covered a lot of these events where people were coming to visit. And you see in his archive the sausage being made. You see images of image making. So here we are on the bottom left, we've got a Facebook Live video going out. Bottom right, documentary crew. I think it's the same crew as in the top left. And then we've got, is it Telemundo? I can't read that woman's mic, but that's at an event celebrating the graduation and the achievements of the coding program that runs in San Quentin. Eddie makes really good portraits. Aside of all of these news archive shots, we were going to have 6 of his portraits framed and given the special treatment at SF Camerawork. I had to put this in to be faithful to Eddie. Eddie loved photographing the nature. I've got no time for his nature shots. Don't think they tell you or me anything new. On the left here is an episode of Ear Hustle being recorded. That's Mesro with his Dungeons and Dragons cards. San Quentin baseball team. Oh, that might be the softball team. San Quentin has 2 baseball teams. They have the Giants and the A's. And the softball team is called the Hard Timers. This is my favorite photograph that Eddie has made. And this is 2 guys calling a basketball match that everyone else is looking on. Right? And I want you to ask yourselves as you're looking at these images, like, to what degree is it obvious in any of these that this is a prison? And where might that fact escape us? To the relatively informed eye, you could figure it out here. You spot the barbed wire at the top. Might recognize that uniform as prison blues. This is Earlonne Woods getting his makeup before he chats with Ted Koppel on camera. This is from the visiting room. Once a year, the Marine Corps donates toys to the veterans group on the inside, and the veterans group distributes toys to children who are coming to visit their parents, grandparents, family at Christmas time. In the red jacket is a volunteer. Her name has slipped my mind right now, but she for a long time has worked with the San Quentin News as an advisor and a mentor. And on the right is a photograph of a young man on the celebratory Day of Peace, which is a celebration out on the yard at San Quentin. Here's our very own California Governor Newsom. And actually just over his shoulder there with the white hair, that's Gascon, I believe, the former DA of San Francisco, now running for, is it DA or Mayor of Los Angeles? Like I said, celebrity visits in San Quentin are not unusual. All right, let's move on to Wray's work. I think the other thing I'll say that I should have mentioned earlier is that of the artists in the show, Brandon, Pendarvis, Adam, Bob, and Wray are all Bay Area based image makers. Jodi is up in Portland, and the Free Mind Collective is everywhere. So that was another point of pride for me, to be able to bring together bodies of work made by folks in the Bay Area that either have not been seen at all in public or have not been exhibited, let's say. Maybe we'll hear from Brandon and Adam and Bob later. So Wray's project is called State Between. And the issue here that to be honest, angered Wray was that when his friend Dennis here was locked up, he didn't have the option to go visit Dennis in person. And that's because the county had decided that it was going to replace in-person visits entirely with video visitation. Wray calls this virtual visitation because it's such a poor imitation of life. Apart from that debate, which we're welcome to have about whether, you know, having human touch and in-person meetings is, you know, akin to a human right or a civil right, or just a measure of decency, is the fact that video visitation is expensive. Wray reports that the quality isn't that great either. It's pixelated, the audio chops in and out. So his friend Dennis was locked up for 12 months. And for the majority of that time, he and Wray collaborated on this portrait project. They made in excess of 1,500 images. I've seen about 400 of them. This is a much wider selection than that which we're going to show in the gallery. When Wray and Dennis spoke to one another first, Wray had his camera with him inside in the picture, and the deputy who was monitoring the feed just cut the call. And so Wray set up a system whereby he could photograph a screen that was connected to his laptop. And, you know, I don't even need to say relatively or comparatively. This is harmless fun. If we take out the sinister nature of the environment, this is harmless fun. And who says how you should behave on your half-hour call? And who says whether you should or should not connect to your buddy on the inside twice a week in order to make a visual record of your friendship and that moment that he's incarcerated? And so they just developed this very slow, silent way of working where the phone receiver would be put down and then sort of like a performance would ensue. And there would be sort of like gesture and direction. But apart from the fantastic palette that exists in this series, it's more that sort of like mood, the insistence on human connection and concentration on the details, even within this cool, insipid, institutional environment. And I should also say the video piece that Wray created, we have not put on the website, and that was a deliberate choice. If you go to the page devoted to State Between, Wray and I have a discussion about the video and why we don't feel it's right to share online, because a lot is lost. When Wray designed this for exhibition, he put his 8-minute video onto sort of, not an antique, but an old tube television with the RGB monitor, right? And so you get the pixelation, the distortion that we can see here in the photographs of the eyes particularly. And so that was something that you had to stand in. The monitor itself was standing against a wall reflected in a mirror. So you had to like consciously put yourself in the space and remain in that tight space in order to consume the work. So in some way, you know, Wray wanted to point back to these like almost cupboards, small 6x6 rooms that the video visitation occurs within. All right, Bob, you ready? Feel free to interrupt anytime, Bob. So this was never intended as an artistic project by Bob. I think that's fair to say. And there's a whole backstory to why these images exist. Up until December of last year, Bob was visiting the San Francisco County jails on a weekly basis to make portraits and to record audio testimony of men and women inside. Prior to making those portraits and prior to the prisoner being delivered to the room, this room, Bob would just like check his light settings, make some test shots. And so he focused on the white wall at the other end of the room. After a while, he started to notice that there was like certain themes and affirmations that were included on the blackboard. And the majority of them were from a Bible study group. Let's see if I've got an example here. So here you are, saved, never to backslide. 2 Peter 14-10, Mark 14:66-72. The plan of salvation, Matthew 1:21. And then I have no idea who wrote this or to what the phrase refers, but here is where we found our title for the series. Bob and I had many long discussions about what this series should be called. Bob, can you tell us when you made the first image and when you made the last image? You'll have to turn your microphone on, Bob.
How about now?
Perfect.
Probably I made the first in this room and of the wall. I would guess what, 2010?
Wow. Okay.
Like that. I mean, I started in the jail in 2006, and I could go in any jail at that point. And then I just, in the beginning of each shoot, as you said, I'm actually in an interview room across the hall. And so I would go in this room because that's where they held these. It was big, and I could do a camera test. And it's, you know, I got kind of interested in, I've always been interested in the printed word and what people have to say.
Yeah.
So that's why I photographed this.
Yeah.
But I wasn't interested in creating a piece of art. I was more interested in just documenting the insanity of the quotes, or at least what I saw is the insanity of the quotes.
Okay. The insanity. Everyone remember that word. That's sort of like the frame for looking at this work. It's a good job I asked, Bob, because I thought you'd started, your first picture was like 2013, 2014, only 5
It could be. I mean, I was in all the jails for a long time.
13 and a half years, yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, it could be. This was a jail that was hard. This This is the jail they say they're going to close in November.
Right.
And for a long time, it was the top security facility for San Francisco. And I would have difficulty going in. And there wasn't really any nice place to photograph, meaning light, decent light. So I didn't go up there much. And then it became the only place I could go.
Mm.
So maybe it was 2012, something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think when I was talking at the start about those overlaps between the bodies of work, so all of them in a different way demand that you slow down and you pay attention to the details. So for the gallery, we had planned a huge grid of, was it 36 prints, Bob? All printed at 20 by 24 inches. So it would occupy 2 walls and be floor to ceiling essentially, which would allow you to then get into the details and to see the subtle differences. And the reason that this excited me when you showed it to me was because those subtle differences describe the passage of time. Photography has this sort of like fractured relationship with time. And sometimes people make the mistake of, well, if you do something in accumulation, then that will sort of like dictate the time and the scale, but it's not about the number of images made over time. It's about the evidence of time within the images. And also, and I think this was sort of like your main anger and sort of like framing of it all as being insane, is that there's a reason that religious groups and Bible study predominates. And that's because it's considered, for whatever reason, as being a safe program. It's sanctioned by the county. It's all about turning to God and begging for salvation and relying on something that's sort of like outside of our physical world, right? Which is kind of a cop-out, but I also understand why that is so tempting, and also actually sort of like a route for some folks. My problem with it, and my problem with it throughout America's prisons and jails, is that insistence upon the prisoner taking some sort of responsibility in front of God and not necessarily in front of other human beings, puts all of the blame, however that's been described or framed or narrated, it puts all the blame on them and for them to correct, and doesn't allow for the space for society to be like, hey, you know what, maybe we're on the hook for this also. Yeah, this person did these terrible things, but can we blame them when they were surrounded by terrible things for a majority of their life? You know, I'm not a psychologist. We do have one in the room. We may have more than one in the room. So I don't want to like get too involved in amateur psychology, but we are this interesting mix of nature and nurture. And I'm not so sure that Bible study should predominate when I have seen and been involved in robust high school and college education programs, which don't ask you to think about God, but ask you to think about social order and social strata and your position within that, and race and class within the United States. So I suppose the last thing I will say is, if we're going to talk about insanity, it's insane to me that education is considered at times problematic, but Bible study, the door is flung open for it. Okay, and on to Adam. I should give a big shout out here to Heather Snyder. Heather Snyder was the former executive director of SF Camerawork, and she was the one that contacted me and said, hey, I've just found this really interesting body of work by Adam Chin at one of our member crits, and I think it would be a good fit. And I almost lost the plot when she sent me some sample images. Now, this body of work takes a bit of explanation, and I'll try and not mangle it, but we do have Adam in the room, so he can correct me where I go wrong. On the left here, you see an archive mugshot. Adam pulled 524 archive mugshots from a public domain government database. And then what he did was he treated them to a version of a neural network, machine learning, that he tweaked a little bit. And then he ran the mugshots through. The program functions, so if you put in a frontal picture, it will spit out a profile view. And if you put in a profile view, it will spit out a frontal view. So this is pointing towards facial recognition technology that is so sophisticated, if it has a partial or side view, then it will be able to reconstruct a faithful other view of your face. Imagine that. We're now talking about images that are made not from any lens or sensor or equipment being pointed at a thing. We're talking about images, photorealistic images being made based upon the artificial intelligence that has taught itself from a data set. Now, the reason why the output here is so sketchy is because the data set that Adam used is only 500 or so deep. To get increased accuracy with machine learning and AI facial recognition, you need a data set of 250,000 as a start. 500,000 is good. 1 million is great. Once you get sort of like above 1 million, then you can start to predict accurate returns. Adam, how am I doing? Am I describing this correctly for you?
It's fine. Yeah. Keep going.
And so it's a warning shot across the bows, this. There of course isn't any single artistic project that really does reflect the nefariousness and so like the creep, the encroachment of AI, facial recognition AI at our doorstep. But it is coming. And the reason there's, no artistic project that's right up to date is because facial recognition is being perfected by the military, by DARPA, by Silicon Valley. This is not ordinarily the subject that we would see on gallery walls. We have seen in recent decades a massive increase in the market for antique mugshots. But that sort of like points backwards towards nostalgia and to a fetishism. Adam is asking us to look forward and imagine this brave new world that we're heading towards. And he shows us what he can do, and therefore, what feasibly any free person who wants to put in the research can do with these off-the-shelf machine learning programs. I don't know what is more spooky, these sort of like ethereal nowhere images that point to an unnerving future, or if the more spooky thing would be an actual exact photorealist picture. And it might be a bit of a stretch for me as a curator to ask you to look at these and then even imagine or believe that what's coming is perfectly sewn, suited, seamless facial recognition technology. Because it will be used in a more and more exacting manner. Adam and I and a couple of others, we're going to have a panel in about 5 or 6 weeks about artificial intelligence and art and facial recognition. And we're going to bring in some experts, and they're going to be able to describe to us exactly how pernicious this could get. It doesn't have to get pernicious, of course. We can decide as a society what we deem acceptable. And possibly what we want to refuse. It's putting a lot of trust in ourselves as a society to be able to take on those complex discussions together. And this is our last body of work. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you briefly these pictures, which are stills, but then I'm going to go to this San Francisco Camerawork website so you can see exactly the nature of the work and where these stills were pulled from. But briefly, some background on the work. This is by Oakland-based artist Brandon Tauszik and Oakland-based journalist Pendarvis Harshaw. You may listen to Harshaw's podcast on KQED Arts right nowish. And they worked together over a long period of time, a couple of years, I think, traveling up and down the state so that they got a fair range of gender, race, original crimes, and sort of like a geographic spread. And in that time, they met 8 people, 8 subjects. Gary here is one of them, Fahim, Traviel, and Melvin. So Fahim is in Vallejo. Don't know where Gary is. I know there was subjects in San Jose and in Los Angeles. And so each of these 8 people, without changes in the law at the state level, would still be inside. These are people who were sentenced to life and life without parole. And it's only because of changes in the law in recent years, some state bills that the politicians put through, and some proposition ballots that were on our voting slips. So Prop 36, the first one listed there, was the revisiting of the 3 strikes law that the people passed overwhelmingly in 2012. Prop 47 was a proposition that reduced sentences for certain crimes, non-violent crimes, and Prop 57 revisited the sentences of juveniles who'd been sentenced as juveniles for crimes committed as juveniles, and you know, realized that a 40 or a 50-year-old 30 years or more after committing the crime probably isn't the same person. There's an endless list of why people should be let out of prison, but possibly people who are serving life sentences for crimes, capital crimes usually, committed when they were very young, should be top of the list for consideration, because those people statistically are the least likely to recidivate or reoffend. It's like down in the single digits, like 1, 2, 3% likelihood. Let's go look at some GIFs. Hey, Brandon, can you tell us the difference between a GIF and a cinematograph?
Jargon.
Now, but we've always called them documentary GIFs, and then recently I've noticed you've started calling them cinemagraphs. Is it because you just prefer the term, or?
I'm conflicted. So Tapered Throne, which is a project that Pete, you're familiar with, that came out in 2015, that was all of those looped photographs, if we want to call them, were embedded online on the project page as .gifs. So it was definitely a GIF-based project. As I've continued to kind of work with this medium, I've incorporated color and longer time, longer duration, and slow motion. And you can't use the .gif file format anymore for these kind of longer, more colorful, heavier files. It's a file format from the 80s, originally, you know, to display video on the internet when our bandwidths were very short and YouTube didn't exist. So it's a very outdated medium. So what you're looking at now is kind of like an MP4 video loop, and that's kind of what I'm using to display the work online these days. So if we're getting technical, they're not GIFs anymore.
Yeah. And so I hope over the screen share, the subtlety and the fine craft of these is coming through for people. And like with Tapered Throne, my attraction to these is that they're documentary, but they're trying to do something distinctly different to documentary photography. How many documentary photographs are out there in the world? Tens of millions, hundreds of millions? How many GIFs or cinemagraphs that have been made in the documentary style and with sort of like journalist integrity exist in the world? Not that many. I'm guessing it's probably in the hundreds, maybe thousands, and Brandon's probably done half of them. This is Lynn. How did you describe her, Brandon? Firecracker. We're hoping to get Lynn involved in an event also later online with SF Camerawork, Lynn, Fahim, talking about how it has been for them after 20, 30 years, returning to society and facing life.
Yeah, Lynn's down in Monterey. She actually just got married to another ex-lifer.
Wow. And, you know, we have to wrap up soon and get into our discussion groups. But my main takeaway from speaking with you and you and Penn, was that the most amount of support that these lifers get when they are released is from other lifers.
Correct. Yeah, there's kind of an underground railroad in place, so to speak, where basically lifers that have come out and learned the ropes on their own, usually with the support of other ex-lifers, will then kind of reach back, each one and be in contact with new lifers that are coming out, or people that they knew while they were incarcerated. Oftentimes they're definitely helping people that they did not know while they were incarcerated. They're just simply helping them go to the Verizon store or go to the DMV or explain, you know, the frustrating method of the internet.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for the background, Brandon. I'm also aware of the irony that I'm over time. I'm rushing to finish. But I also want to point out that with this body of work, it's the slowness and these cinemagraphs, which when they are displayed are 19 inches square on a backlit screen, you know, they demand again that you slow down. They create this meditative space. And so I'm very proud that these are being exhibited for the first time with SF Camerawork. But I've spoken enough there and I'm over time. And so I'm going to throw it back to Dave or Christina for them to explain what is happening next.
Yeah, so there's about 50 of us, so we're just going to break into small groups so we can actually talk to one another. And then we'll come back and have some time for Q&A. So it's not, you're going to meet some new people as you would if we were in the gallery.
Okay. Oh, do we have a prompt? Do we want the people to think about anything, particularly while they're in their rooms?
I think that's your curator's discretion.
All right. Well, I mean, the feedback that I always seek is, do these pictures in this context do what I propose that they do? How do they inform you, if at all, and in what ways do they inform you about the issues in a new way? So in that, you can look at the content, or you can look at the approach, the technique, and sort of like ascertain whether, assess whether you think the work is successful or not. And I've got quite a thick skin, so but I want you to say if the images are doing what we want them to do, which is to raise awareness about the many issues within mass incarceration. Okay.
All right, so I'm in charge of splitting everyone off, and we all have 10 minutes. So we're gonna be out in about 5-person groups, and you'll get a little prompt when we're coming back. And then it'll be time to ask Pete some questions and the artists who are here. So
well, that's it as well. Just put together questions for the Q&A.
Yeah, ready? Ready.
How was other people's breakout rooms? Was it a way to actually connect with people? You might be on mute, by the way.
Oh, everyone's here. I would say yes.
It's amazing to see everybody shuffle back together.
It's like Star
We
Trek.
got broken off. But so that's what, just to finish that up, that's what happened. And that, when I moved to the 7th floor, I wasn't allowed in the housing area to take pictures. And so I couldn't see how people lived. And if I can't see how people lived, then I couldn't dream up questions to ask.
Cool.
But by then I mean, the stuff on the blackboards just made me angry. I mean, I don't think much of religion to begin with, as Pete knows, but for me, it wasn't that they were trying to be given an excuse or told you have to take responsibility, you have to give yourself to God. It was just more of this business of, we're going to remake you into the person because we decide what kind of person you should be. We are going to remake you into this person. And that person is going to be a worthwhile member of society. And to do that, it's like the old Marine Corps business. When I was young and under the draft, I didn't go, but everybody I knew who went to the Marine Corps, the first thing they told you is, you no longer exist. We're going to destroy the person you are, and we're going to make you a Marine, because that's somebody of value. Well, that's what they do in the jail and the prisons. And the religious services, to me, play a big role in doing that. And it isn't that for me, it isn't that the ministers or the guys come in and are trying to make you a better person, accept God, and he'll be your savior and all that. That isn't it to me. It's just, you are a worthless son of a bitch. And we are going to make you into somebody who is good and an honor to be a member of society. But all that stuff that they were telling me, worthless. All the stories they told me, all the stuff about how they made stuff and why they played games and what they did with the games and the poetry they did or the singing they did, all that's worthless, because it comes from this worthless culture that you have. That's what, and that isn't, frankly, that isn't all that different than what I thought I was going to find in the jail when I first went in the second time around in 2006.
All right, thanks, Bob. In 2 weeks' time, is it 2 weeks or is it 4 weeks? I forget the order of things. We're going to have an artist panel with Bob and Eddie, and maybe one other artist from the show. So Bob can really get into it a little bit further. We have 7 minutes left.
Yeah, does anybody want to get a question or two out?
Bang a question in, super quick. Then you have to go to your bottom left and unmute.
The unmute.
I'm actually curious where exactly you would find, hi, I'm Boris. Where exactly you tend to find your the bodies of work that you then include in your projects. I mean,
yeah, I mean it's a mix. There is some sort of like soft core nepotism going on in some cases, but this is why I started by saying it's sort of like 5 years in the making. It's not like 5 years of daily frantic research, but that's just how long it takes for these things to come to me. So Brandon and I have known one another for, I don't know, 6 years, maybe more. And his prior body of work, I curated into a show in late 2015. That show was about the greater San Francisco Bay Area. Bob, likewise, I've known Bob for a decade because of his work in the prisons, in the jail. So I cold Bob in like 2011 and just showed up at his front door. And so that was something, because of our relationship, he showed me these photographs of the blackboards and I just kept it in my mind. And I think it was a year or two had passed. And then I said, like, Bob, I'd like to put these in a show. Adam, his work was introduced to me by Heather. And that was through a SF Camerawork members critique. Jodi, I had an idea for a video piece and so like some of the elements that it would involve, and Jodi is an old friend from Portland, and so when I wanted to commission video art, she was the person I called, and she knocked it out of the park. She did fantastically. Anka Schutler, I also know from my time in Portland. I have close ties with a lot of folks at Portland State University. Who else is in there? Wray. Wray was a assistant to a photographer that a lot of people in the Bay Area will know, called McNair Evans. And so McNair called me up one day and said, you need to look at Ray's work. He's got a friend in county jail and he's been making images. And that was almost 4 years ago, I think. And Ray only finished the fabrication of the piece, you know, in the past few months. Who else is there? Jodi, Ray, Adam, Bob, Penn, and then Eddie. I knew Eddie from my year of teaching with the Prison University project at San Quentin, 2018, 2019. So the simple answer is, I don't have to work that hard. And because I've been looking at this type of imagery for more than a decade, when I see something that's different, it sticks in my head. And then I only need like half a dozen of those, and then there's a show.
Another question? Anyone?
I have a question.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, my name is Janet Molbatani. Hi. I was wondering what's your story in terms of getting engaged about mass incarceration? You know, everyone I talk to who feels strongly about getting rid of mass incarceration usually has a kind of interesting story about how they got engaged. So I'm curious about what yours is.
Yeah, it's not that interesting, but I will say I know what you mean. And a lot of people who are working in activism in California are doing so because they have to, out of necessity. It's because they have a loved one or a family member inside. We've just published the Curators essay today on the SF Camerawork webpage, and I list a lot of the organizations, activist, reform, mostly abolitionist groups, who are doing great work. For me, I got turned on to this issue in 2004 when I was doing a master's in museum studies, and I wanted to return to California. I'd studied out here prior. And so I pitched a thesis, a master's thesis, on the little tiny museum at San Quentin, which is still there. I think you can still like...
Yeah, I've been there, yeah.
Yeah, it's very strange, which was the summary of my master's thesis. But in order to evaluate the narrative in that space, I had to read about what was happening in real life in the summer of 2004. And I was just pissed off, Janet. I was angry. I came down after a few months, and then I was like, okay, this is my issue. I've got to get to work here. It was like a lot of the things that confused me as an outsider, but like also attracted me to America as this like strange, wonderful, big place, but still like I couldn't quite put my finger on. A lot of those things started to make sense when I looked at it through a lens of criminal justice and mass incarceration. I was like, oh, that explains why that connects to these types of relations between these types of groups. The media is here. So it all came down to sort of like personal responsibility, visual diets, the rhetoric we have, what politicians say and what we repeat and mimic, and then so like, what's the reality?
I believe that the way that a society deals with its criminals, if you will, is a reflection of its society, of the society itself. You don't have to do it by warehousing. It's just it's a choice that we made in the mid 1980s.
I always say that it was the year of my birth, like, so I can say this has happened in my lifetime. 1980 onward, mass incarceration grip. And that's what I was just saying in the breakout rooms. The reason I feel like reforms might not be enough and like massive decarceration is necessary, the reason I can say that we could release 1 million people in the next few years and say it with confidence is because this is a man-made system. We've done it in decades, so it can be unmade.
Like, for example, in California, in the year 2000, there were 180,000 inmates. So do you know how many there were just in 1980 when you were born?
Well, it would have been a fourth or a fifth of that. It would have
actually only
25,000.
20,000. So I mean, that's all just from in 20 years. We couldn't make prisons fast enough in California. We only had 10 prisons then, and we built another 25, but that's not enough to accommodate the 9 times the population. And so then that's how we ended up with the crowding and the poor access to medical care, which is getting a lot better now. But the population is down to about 120,000 now. So it's not down to anything close to 20,000.
Well, and it's still not down to its design capacity. It must still be functioning at like 110, 120% design.
Yeah, it's 137.5%.
So we are a little bit over time, but I think Janet, the way you highlighted that this was a decision we made as a culture is a really keen observation. And as Pete has mentioned a couple times, we are developing more programming around cell signals. So we will have time to come together as a community again to look at this work and to talk about that decision we've made together again. So thank you all so much for coming to our first Curators Talk. Thank you, Pete, for pulling this together. I know we expected it to be in the gallery. I want to give a huge shout out to Christina Graber and Senny Mao, without whom this would not have been possible. We have our members critique coming up on Thursday, and look for more programming to be announced around this. And again, this is why San Francisco Camerawork exists. It is to promote programming like this and is to promote artists like these. So we rely on your membership and your donations. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Tell your friends. And I look forward to seeing you all again next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I really appreciate your attendance. Temple, I'll give you a call tomorrow. Boris, I'll see you tomorrow. Michael, I'm going to have my birthday party at your house eventually. But for all of you for joining tonight, I really do. I thank you so much. It's great.
Thank you.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.